the hidden deal that split a country in two. It happened quietly, behind closed doors, while the public was distracted by larger crises unfolding elsewhere. No votes were cast, no crowds gathered, and no warnings were given to the people whose lives would soon be divided by a decision they never saw coming. This story matters today because some of the most powerful changes in history are not made in public moments of drama, but in private agreements that reshape nations without accountability. What appears stable on the surface often hides decisions that were never meant to be seen, only felt. At the time, the country stood at a fragile crossroads, weakened by internal pressure, external threats, and leaders desperate to preserve control in a rapidly changing world. Foreign powers watched closely, calculating influence, resources, and strategic advantage, waiting for the right moment to intervene without appearing to do so. The vulnerability was not just military or economic. It was structural, rooted in institutions too fragile to resist external manipulation and too divided to present a unified response. The deal itself was framed as temporary, a necessary compromise to prevent chaos and protect national stability. Officials described it as pragmatic, balanced, and carefully designed to satisfy all sides involved. But beneath the language of cooperation, the agreement carved invisible lines through communities, economies, and identities that had developed together for generations. What was divided was not just territory, but trust, opportunity, and the shared understanding of belonging. Families, markets, and traditions that had evolved as one were suddenly expected to function as two, separated by administrative decisions that ignored the organic connections holding them together. At first, the effects were subtle, hidden behind bureaucratic changes and administrative adjustments that felt distant from daily life. Few realized that the agreement had already altered the country's future, setting two paths in motion that would slowly drift apart. This was the beginning of a split that would not arrive with violence or collapse, but through gradual separation disguised as stability. And once a country begins dividing itself in silence, reunification becomes far more difficult than anyone expects. As the hidden deal took effect, its consequences unfolded through policies rather than force, as new administrations, regulations, and priorities quietly replaced the systems people had lived under for decades. Regions once connected by shared markets and infrastructure began operating under different rules, slowly drifting apart as investment, services, and political attention followed separate paths. What had functioned as a single economic body was now forced into parallel systems that duplicated effort, increased cost, and reduced the efficiency that integration had once provided. Citizens noticed a change not through announcements, but through daily friction, longer waits, unequal access, and a growing sense that opportunity now depended on which side of an invisible line they lived. Leaders continued to defend the agreement as a stabilizing measure, insisting that division was preferable to disorder and that gradual adjustment would prevent conflict. But compromise without consent carries a cost, because people adapt outwardly while resentment builds inwardly, especially when decisions feel imposed rather than chosen. The absence of public debate meant that grievances had no legitimate outlet, forcing frustration underground where it grew without correction or release. Education systems diverged, media narratives shifted, and historical interpretation began to separate, shaping different understandings of identity within what was once a single national story. Children on each side learned different versions of the same past, and with each generation the shared memory that might have held the country together faded further. Economic imbalance deepened as one side benefited from proximity to power and resources, while the other absorbed restrictions framed as security necessities. Attempts to question the agreement were discouraged, labeled as dangerous or disloyal, reinforcing silence and preventing open discussion of alternatives. What was once described as temporary became normalized, and normalization transformed division into routine governance rather than an emergency solution. The country was no longer splitting through crisis, but through policy, quietly locking in a future few had openly agreed to. And with each passing year, the cost of reversing the deal grew higher, while the willingness to confront it grew weaker. The conflict reached a deeper level as the two sides began developing incompatible political cultures, each reinforcing its own narrative of legitimacy, grievance, and destiny. What started as administrative separation hardened into ideological distance as laws, values, and priorities moved in different directions without mechanisms for reconciliation. The institutions meant to bridge the divide instead reinforced it. As each administration governed according to its own logic, building systems that were increasingly difficult to merge, even the political will to do so had existed. External powers adapted quickly, engaging with each side separately, strengthening the split by rewarding compliance and stability over unity. Foreign interests found the division convenient, as dealing with two weaker entities offered more leverage than negotiating with one unified state. Internally, frustration grew among those who remembered a shared past, while younger generations accepted division as normal, never experiencing the country as a single entity. Security concerns intensified, not always because of real threats, but because mistrust had become institutionalized, feeding policies that justified further separation. Economic pressure turned into political leverage, as dependence replaced cooperation, limiting choices and deepening resentment on both sides. The buildup was no longer hidden, as protests, crackdowns, and political standoffs exposed how fragile the arrangement truly was. Each attempt to manage tension through control only revealed how much had been lost through silence and delayed confrontation. The country stood divided not by war, but by a deal that had reshaped identity, loyalty, and possibility without ever asking permission. This was the moment when the split stopped being manageable and started becoming irreversible. And history showed that once division reaches a stage, reunification becomes less about agreement and more about survival. The climax arrived when it became clear that the hidden deal had succeeded in one thing only, creating two realities where one nation once existed, each locked into a future shaped by decisions made long ago. The agreement had prevented immediate collapse, but at the cost of long-term cohesion, replacing shared destiny with parallel systems that no longer recognize each other as part of the same story. What was once justified as a temporary safeguard had evolved into a permanent divide, maintained not by force alone, but by habit, fear, and the normalization of separation. The weight of accumulated divergence made reunification feel not just difficult, but alien, as two populations that once shared everything now struggled to find common ground on even basic questions of governance and identity. In reflecting on this outcome, the lesson is not simply about secrecy or betrayal, but about the danger of resolving crises without consent, transparency, or a path back to unity. When people are excluded from decisions that define their identity, stability becomes fragile because silence and delay conflict, but it cannot erase it. Today, this story remains relevant as nations continue to rely on quiet agreements to manage instability, often underestimating how deeply those choices shape generations. The past reminds us that unity cannot be preserved through avoidance, only through participation, accountability, and the willingness to confront difficult truths early. So, what do you think? Are we repeating the same mistake again?